From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. During our first half hour today, a visit with K-State's Romulo Lollato. He'll take a look at the possible damage to new wheat stands from that plunge in temperatures a little over a week ago. Romulo talks about the determining factors such as stand progress, soil moisture conditions, and soil temperatures. He also looks at making management adjustments when sowing wheat this late in the fall for either replanting a failed stand or planting after late harvested row crops. Among the considerations there, seeding rate and starter fertilizer placement with the seed. Later on, K-State's Charlie Lee reports on the outlook for quail hunting opportunities in Kansas, with the season opening across the state this Saturday. Plus more ahead on this Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Thanks for tuning in for another Agriculture Today, as we'll devote our time during this first part of the program to wheat production questions. Now that just over 90% of the intended wheat acreage has been sown in the state, according to the latest numbers just released by the USDA, which is pretty near par for this time of the year. Still, what with the sharp drop in temperatures last week and some issues with planting the crop because of prohibitive field conditions, we've much to talk over now with Romulo Lollato, Mike's side. Romulo, as you know, is a wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension. So, Romulo, a great number of people did get their wheat in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and then that turned downward in the temperature last week, which has brought up some questions about the impact on that wheat crop, right?
Hi, Eric. Yes, definitely. So whenever we look at the amount of wheat that has been planted in the state, right, as far as the last USDA report goes, very different from last year. Things are at least on time this year with some few exceptions, right? So we have the exception of those fields that were probably delayed because of soybean harvest that got delayed to start with, right? So we have a few different scenarios here. Fields that got planted earlier into a fallow production system, for example, or after corn, where we had enough time for each to tiller some, and fields that just now got planted or are still on the way, right? So talking about the first 2 scenarios there and the issue that you brought up with the sharp decrease in temperatures as of last week. What can we see on that wheat crop that has already been planted, right? So let's quickly overview what was the extent of that temperature decrease.
It was dramatic in many parts of the state.
Yes, definitely. So we can look at the Kansas Mesonet and take a look at some of selected stations there. And, for example, a couple of very contrasting stations that represent the wheat country here in Kansas. Let's talk about Cheyenne in the far northwest corner of the state and Harper in the south central part of the state, right? If we talk about those two, we're kind of covering the bulk of the wheat producing region in the state. So definitely out in the northwest part of the state, in Cheyenne there, temperature drop, they were very significant. We really went from that Sunday, I believe October 27th, we went from about mid-70s, so 75 degrees Fahrenheit, to in a period of 3-4 days there, we went to negative temperature, so 0 or even below, I believe -2, that's the lowest air temperature that was recorded. So a very, very sharp decrease in temperatures, right? About a 70-degree range in the northwest part of the state. If we think of the south-central part of the state now, the switch in temperatures was not as sharp. So actually we went from about 60s or so to, I believe, close to the 20s. So we're talking more of a 40-degree change in temperature there. So not anywhere near as sharp as what we saw in northwest Kansas. So with that, what are some considerations? What are some of the potential consequences that we can have for the wheat crop, and how can we tell if those consequences will happen or not? Of course, the first thing that comes to everyone's mind is potential for winter kill. Right? Has the crop survived those cold temperatures? And for us to respond to that, there are many things that we actually need to look at. First and foremost is definitely the soil temperatures. So how warm were the soils? Did we have any buffer capacity in those soils? Or was the temperature drop also quite sharp in the soils as well? Fortunately, we have the K-State Mesonet again to help us with that, and we can look at the 2-inch soil temperature there at the Mesonet. And what we see is that the trends were the same. So we had a decrease in soil temperature. But the magnitude, of course, it was actually much narrower than what we saw in the air temperatures. So again, using North Cheyenne as an example for northwest Kansas, temperatures dropped from about 60 degrees Fahrenheit on October 27th to about 30s on October 31st, right? So still a 30-degree temperature drop, but soil temperatures, at least, they never really got too much colder than about that 30s. Some stations measured down to about 25, which is getting really cold for the wheat crop there. Harper, it was about in the same 60 degrees, and it never really reached below about 40 or so. So a much safer temperature. So can this temperature decrease affect my wheat crop, right? And the true answer for that, we probably won't have, honestly, either if the fall warms up before December now, but most likely until it warms up in the spring. Right, until temperatures really start warming up in the spring, and then we can actually tell how much of that crop is actually bouncing back or not. So a few of the things there, again, these are the temperatures measured at the Mesonet station. If we're talking about individual farms in Kansas or individual fields in Kansas, there are many other things that will affect how cold the soil actually got. Probably the biggest of them being soil moisture.
Right.
So in parts of the state that were dry, that the topsoil was dry, we're definitely going to see a sharper decrease in temperatures. That soil has less buffer capacity against temperature swings like that. And so where we expect most damage will be in soils that were actually pretty dry.
And
right?
There were more than a few fields in that situation out there.
There were. So especially as we look into southwest Kansas, right? Southwest Kansas has been dry for quite some time. There were some scattered rains, so talking to several growers in that part of the state, some of them actually dusted the crop in, but have a pretty decent stand because of some rain that came by later. But still, there is a large portion of the southwest part of the state that is actually quite cold. Probably one of the most important factors there is soil moisture. Again, with drier fields being more likely to have withstand any damage there. Another factor that we need to consider is the age of the wheat stand. So in fields that got planted, say, mid to late September there in the western part of the state, and already have 2, 3, 4 tillers, so that will put the crop at 13 to 15 leaves, more or less, 3 to 5 tillers. That crop is probably much more winter hardy than a crop that is just now emerging. So when the seed is just germinating and the coleoptile is still below ground and just the radicle coming out, that plant is still, it can handle lower temperatures and is still protected by the soil. But once the coleoptile comes out and we have just a single leaf out there or 2, 3 leaves just initiating the first tiller, it is more sensitive to winter kill. It is not as cold hardy as a plant that has 4 or 5 tillers.
It needs that time to harden off, really. And maybe it happened, maybe it didn't.
Definitely, yes. Really, we have had some colder temperatures, so I believe the crop that was planted before probably has cold hardened, but perhaps what I would be somewhat concerned are stands that are just emerged perhaps a few days before that cold swing and just have 1 or 2 leaves out there. That's where I believe we could see some damage as well. So those would be the situations. Another situation that we could expect perhaps a little bit more damage will be in heavy residue conditions, right? So no-till conditions with a heavy residue, and now for a few different reasons. One, that residue is going to maintain that soil temperature cooler. But not only that, not only from the direct effect of the residue on soil temperature, but mostly because sometimes we don't get a very good seed-to-soil contact in those heavy residue situations. We don't get a very good closure of the furrow right after the drill is coming by. And I've seen that very often, especially in fields planted after soybeans, where we're planting late, the field is relatively dry, we go in and we can't really get a good seed-to-soil contact, and we don't really close that furrow very well. That's typically when we see some of these greater potential for a winter kill or for some damage from these cold temperatures. If that's the case, probably the portions of the field where there's heavier residue, maybe due to non-uniform distribution of the residue from the combine or any other reasons, we're going to start to seeing those parts of the field turn yellow earlier than parts with less residue. So that's another factor to keep in mind when thinking about potential for damage from these temperature drops that we had.
Lots of things that could be going on there, but it is, again, very difficult to know for sure until next spring. Asking the question, are there any telltale signs that might be evident here in the coming weeks to indicate cold damage?
This time of the year, it will be challenging. For some of those bigger stands, we're going to see probably some roughness on those leaves. We're going to see some leaf tip dying back, which we will probably see on the younger stands as well. But for sure, right, whether we really had a winter kill or not, and I believe we will need to wait, to be patient and wait some until everything starts greening up in the spring, and that's when we can actually have a much better assessment.
So there may be anxious moments for some producers as they await that spring green up and see what the true impact of those major fall-offs in temperatures had on our winter wheat stands in Kansas the past several days. Romulo, there's another part of this we want to examine, though, and that is those that either have not had an opportunity to plant their wheat yet this fall, or those who may decide they'd like to replant their stands at this quite late date. And we want to dig into the likelihood of that succeeding as well in a moment after this break. Romulo Lollato is our guest, wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension, and we'll tackle those topics with Romulo in a few moments here on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. We're back now on this Agriculture Today. Joining us once more here in the studio, Romulo Lollato. Romulo is a wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension. There are those cases out there, Romulo, where producers may have come to the conclusion that they'd either like to replant their previously sown winter wheat for whatever reason, or they just have been prevented from planting outright because of uncooperative field conditions out there. Asking the basic question here, is it too late to replant for agronomic purposes anyway?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and I think it's that time of the year when we need to try and address these concerns and work with producers so that if they will replant their stand, or if they will plant after a summer crop that just now got harvested, what are some of the management adjustments that they need to do to ensure the highest chance of success? Whether it is too late or not now in early November, I guess it obviously depends on where in the state the producer is located, right? If we're talking about the northwest part of the state, well, we're pushing quite a bit. The northwest Kansas, I think the late part of September is really when we need to be shooting for if we want to have the best yield potential for that crop. But I understand that sometimes either for weather reasons or for field reasons, producers can't be there on time. But we're probably pushing the late part of the sowing window there. If producers are in southeast Kansas or south central Kansas, especially in the far south portion of the state, I think it's still within acceptable. Right, we can still have a decent yield potential in those parts of the state, although definitely decreased from the potential if we had planted it on October 10th or perhaps October 15th there. So we are losing some yield potential as we delay our planting date here.
And although this isn't specifically to yield potential here, but one of the guideposts that producers can use, crop insurance enrollment deadlines, those define this fairly well, don't they?
Yes, definitely. So we need to remember that from the crop insurance perspective there, those cutoff dates are very important as the crop is not insured 100% after those cutoff dates. If producers are working and insuring their crop, that's definitely the first thing that needs to be looked for. What was the cutoff date? And if you're planting now, what percent have you lost from that full coverage that you would have had you planted your crop at the optimal date? So definitely for producers who are insuring their crop, that's the first question to be asked. Is it too late? That's available online for producers to check what's the cutoff date for the different parts of the state. Now, for producers who are still, for example, just done with harvest of a summer crop, right? If you remember back in May and June, there was quite a bit of rainfall that prevented growers from planting soybeans on time. So we're hearing of some producers that are still harvesting soybeans to go for wheat afterwards, although the greatest majority of the wheat fields in Kansas have already been planted. We're looking at maybe a 10% that have not been planted yet and are intended to go for wheat. If you are part of that 10% that are still considering to plant wheat but haven't been able to pull the trigger yet, there are definitely some management considerations that you need to keep in mind in order to make sure that you're still trying to maximize whatever potential is left in that crop.
And that starts with adjustment of seeding rate, by and large?
Definitely, Eric. So let's think as the plant would, right? If we're planting the wheat on time, the plant will have enough temperature to tiller during the fall, provided that we have enough moisture, right? And we plant it on time, there's enough temperature to produce 3, 4, 5 tillers in the fall. That's where we would like to be. However, if we're planting it now and we are already seeing these very cold temperatures, then the plant is going to feel the same and it's not going to have as much time to tiller. So to compensate for that, increasing seeding rates can, to some extent, compensate to the decreased tillering potential. Let's remember what really matters at harvest are two things: the number of grains that we have out there and the grain weight, right? Those two things is what's going to determine our yield. To ensure that we have the right amount of number of grains out there, we need enough heads out there as well. And to produce those enough heads, we typically rely on tillering. However, planting this late, we need to rely more on those main stems, the main plant. So we need more of them out there. So definitely, recommendation is if you know what the optimal planting date is for your region, for your farm, for every week that you're past that optimum, probably bumping those seeding rates up in about 10% or so is typically warranted. That's what we would recommend.
And along with that, does one adjust their seeding depth to compensate for the late date?
Well, that's a tricky question, and I've heard many times growers suggesting that they would plant a little bit shallower, so to try and get the emergence earlier and still trying to capitalize some on whatever temperature there is for tillering. Typically, I would rather maintain the seeding depth at what the optimum is typically for you. I would avoid too deep. I would avoid going to 2 inches depth or more. But I would try and keep it to 1 inch, maybe 1.5 inches depth. And the reason for that is to really protect the crown. If we're planting too shallow, there is the risk of winter kill. Say that crop emerges and starts forming the crown too close to the surface, well, there is always the risk of winter kill there. So I would still, even though planting at 1 inch might delay emergence in 2 or 3 days compared to planting shallower than that, I would still rather have the wheat planted at the optimum depth, about 1 inch, perhaps 1.5 inches.
What about planting time fertility and actually placing product with that seed as one would sow this late in the season?
That definitely helps, Eric. So let's think of this as if you're putting fertilizer in furrow with the seed, that fertilizer is going to be very readily available for that developing seedling. The fertilizers that we look for the most in that situation are phosphorus, right, because phosphorus is really going to trigger that early development and that tillering as well, and nitrogen as well. Of course, with nitrogen, you need to be concerned with how much we're putting out there. We typically don't want more than 20, maybe up to 30 units of actual N with the seed, because it is a salt, right? And as a salt, it can actually desiccate the seed as well. So probably what we're looking for is the combination of maybe 25, 30 units of phos out there with the seed, and perhaps 10 units of nitrogen out with the seed in furrow that can really improve early season tillering, early season biomass, and early season development. So as we're planting late like this, that's our recommendation. If your drill can put fertilizer in furrow, that's, in this situation, typically money in the bank.
On that nitrogen question, briefly, if you're following soybeans, a legume which fixes nitrogen, any chance of residual N that you can take advantage of from that soybean crop?
So that's a good question, and we come across that very often. And at this point, I mean, right immediately after harvest like these, because temperatures are cold, we typically don't count with that very much. In fact, there's some research, both here from K-State and from Nebraska as well, showing that depending on the yield levels of your soybean crop, they're actually removing nitrogen. So if you had a very good soybean crop above 60 bushels, 50, 60 bushels per acre or more, chances are that it's actually removing nitrogen rather than putting it back. So typically, especially planting late like this, I wouldn't really rely much on that. Now, of course, if it's a cover crop that is going to release that nitrogen later on and it was terminated so that a legume cover crop we typically give nitrogen credits for that. But most times they don't come until the spring. So if our concern right now is a good emergence and a good stand establishment, that in furrow fertilizer, our goal is not really to supply much of what the crop is going to need there, but to supply it readily so the crop can actually get off to a good start.
And one last consideration here, again, with the purpose of giving that late-planted wheat every opportunity to succeed, one should probably be planting with a fungicide seed treatment in place to give that new seedling full protection.
Yeah, so we have been doing quite a few studies looking at the value of that fungicide seed treatment, fungicide and insecticide seed treatment, actually. And what we see is that for the fungicide specifically, these late plantings in cooler conditions, that's typically a situation when it tends to pay off. Think of it this way, right? The soil is cooler, it's colder, so it's going to take much longer for that seedling to emerge than had we planted it back early October or in the optimal time when the soil was warmer. So with that prolonged exposure, we're actually increasing our chances of any potential fungal disease infection there as well. And so our recommendations, if possible, would be to use a fungicide seed treatment at this point in time.
All of that said, it's important that the producer understand that there is a fair amount of risk involved in planting wheat this late, no matter what the scenario, right?
Yes, we're definitely working with a lower yield potential, but there are some things that some management practices that we can adjust to try and still take the most out of that crop.
And accordingly, there are 3 articles that have just been posted in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter series out of K-State addressing replanting of wheat or planting late following a row crop, as well as that question of whether or not those harsh cold temperatures of several days back inflicted damage on winter wheat stands that had emerged. You can find all of that at agronomy.ksu.edu, as always. Thanks for covering all of this, Romulo. We'll have you back again soon.
Thank you, Eric.
Wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato, K-State Research and Extension, our guest on this first part of Agriculture Today. We'll stand aside now and then return with much more here on the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Now in our 95th year of broadcast service to Kansas agriculture, Eric Atkinson here. Now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. And we're edging ever closer to tying off the row crop harvest in Kansas, according to this week's account from the USDA. For the week ending on Sunday, our topsoil moisture supplies, 2% surplus, 67% adequate, and 31% short to very short. Subsoil moisture, 3% surplus, 71% adequate, and 26% short to very short. The condition of the Kansas winter wheat crop this week is called 55% good to excellent, 33% fair, 12% poor to very poor. Winter wheat planting now 94% complete. That's right near the average. And emergence at 72%. That's also on the average. The corn harvest then is at 83% complete in Kansas. That's behind the 89% average for the date. Soybean harvest at 70% done, behind the 77% average. And the grain sorghum harvest at 69% complete. That is ahead of the 63% average for the date here in the state of Kansas. As for the advance of the corn and soybean harvests nationally, this update from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Even in the drier areas last week in the upper Midwest, corn growers still dealing with
soggy soils and delayed crop maturation, which has led to high moisture content corn.
USDA meteorologist Brad Bibby. Nationally, we do have 96% of the corn crop mature. Usually it's 100%, but as to the corn harvest,
52% overall. That is significantly behind the 5-year average of 75% and last year's 74%.
And looking at a few states, it's a lot worse.
Some incredible numbers. For example, North Dakota, 10% harvested. 5-year average is 60%.
And states at least 30% behind normal corn harvest right now. Illinois, Minnesota, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. Of course, some producers waiting on corn to get the more delicate soybeans into the bin. As we start this week, soybean farmers have 3/4 of that crop in the bin.
That, though, is still 12 percentage points behind the 5-year average of 87%. Also behind last year's 81%.
And as you might expect from seeing the weather reports lately,
the biggest delays compared to average are across the north, where it has been colder and wetter of late. North Dakota, again, really standing out as an outlier. 56% of the soybeans harvested on November 3rd. 5-year average is 95%.
Soybean harvest is at least 20% behind normal in Michigan and Wisconsin. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
Additionally, as of Sunday, nationally, 89% of the winter wheat had been planted. That's very near the average. And wheat emergence at 71%. That's just shy of the 74% average. The grain sorghum harvest nationally at 78% complete. That's ahead of the 5-year average of 72%. Elsewhere in the headlines, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross says he is optimistic that the U.S. would reach a Phase 1 trade deal with China this month and said licenses would be coming very shortly for American companies to sell components to Huawei Technologies, adding that the government received 260 such requests. China also gave a positive readout on the situation. U.S. and Chinese trade officials were able to reach a consensus on principles, according to a statement released by China's Commerce Department. The negotiators moved on to begin discussing Phase 2, according to the Chinese. As for a location for the signing of the agreement, there are options in the U.S. and in China that are being considered at the moment there. Now, for you, this week's Milk Lines from K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the moisture content of some of the silages that we have stored on our farms. As I look through reports that I see coming in on various forage analysis, I'm becoming aware that we probably have some less than desirable forages stored out there on our farms. One of the big issues with silages is the dry matter content. And with some of the early frost that we had and late forages, as far as harvesting, we're seeing some dry matters on those forages come in higher than what we might expect. So here's some things to think about if you're in this boat. If you have forages, silages, stored on your farm that are greater than 38% dry matter, we could have an issue with secondary fermentation in those forages. Yes, it'll be less of a problem during the winter months, but it's still possible even during the cooler weather to have these issues. So what are some things that you maybe need to be thinking about? Well, one of the things you have to think about is face management of the feed as you feed it out. Whether we're in a bunker silo or a drive-over pile or even with a bag, we do have to consider our face management. So when we have these types of silages, we generally pack them with less density. Part of that is because just naturally it's harder to pack them as the dry matter content of the silage increases, but also we have a tendency for that face to fall off, start to break down, and we end up with a lot of forage down at the base of the face. And as a result of that, there's a greater degree of secondary heating because that forage generally stays there for more than a day. So a couple of things to consider. Number one, somebody should be checking, probably on a daily basis, whether or not that forage is heating. And again, depending on how long that face is exposed to oxygen will have an impact on whether or not we find heating in there. Yes, ambient temperature is part of the equation, but again, even in cold temperatures, if that feed has been knocked down for a few days before it's actually fed, great chance that we might have some secondary fermentation. Now, what are some other things that you could maybe consider doing? Well, if we have smaller faces, in other words, if we move back further each day, we should be feeding at least a foot off the face if we have these types of forages that are unstable. Keeping in mind that corn silage might be more unstable than something like an alfalfa haylage, just because of the energy found in that. So movement of the face, again, trying to move at least 12 inches a day is probably the first thing we should consider. What if you cannot move the face that much each day? Well, if you're having issues with secondary fermentation, you may need to include some mold inhibitor into your TMR. There are many different products out there available that will actually inhibit the growth of mold in that TMR and can reduce the amount of additional secondary fermentation that we actually see in the monk. So if you're noticing some warm forage at the base of your silo, you need to be thinking about options that you have to try to reduce that heating in order to prevent issues with production in your dairy herd. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension.
All right, Mike, many thanks to you, as always. Our podcast service, if you haven't yet, check it out at agtoday.net. That again is agtoday.net. And we will return in a moment. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and checking in once more for his weekly visit is wildlife specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension. This coming Saturday, Charlie, the opening of the quail hunting season in Kansas, and opportunities abound, which we'll talk about. The quail numbers overall in Kansas have been on a state of general recovery in recent years, haven't they?
Yes, and I think this year will actually be a good season. The upland bird forecast predicts that quail hunting should be good throughout the region this year. The spring whistle survey had a slight decline. However, there was a significant increase that was observed on the roadside surveys compared to what was last year. That significant increase was 46%. So that tells me that there was a good survival of young birds. Perhaps some of the early things in the spring, the unfortunate heavy rains, probably hurt some of the young broods, and things have seem to have rebounded in most parts of the state. There are certainly things that impact the availability of upland birds during the fall hunting season. Those are always subject for discussion amongst hunters as, well, if they were all here during the fall counts, where are they now during hunting season? And perhaps we'll talk about some of those causes of birds disappearing or appearing to disappear next time. But remember that weather certainly plays a role in how well you can find quail during the season. And remember that fall populations are really dependent on the summer reproduction rate, not really how many adult birds are found in the spring.
In a few moments, we want to go over tips for succeeding with the quail hunt, but expanding a bit on what the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism has put out on its quail forecast for this year, what are the general hot spots expected anyway?
Well, the hot spot is in the Smoky Hill region. That's generally north-central Kansas. That's where we had the biggest increase. I think there you're going to see hunting that's way better than average, and it was above average densities of quail last year. Targeting those areas that supported good quail numbers last year will also support good quail numbers this year. And that's a pretty easy area of the state to get to for most people since it's right in the center. Certainly a lot of walk-in hunting areas available. There's also some wildlife management areas available within that region. When we have about 1.7 million acres that's open to public hunting, certainly a part of that is going to be in that Smoky Hills region. Flint Hills areas should be good this year. They had a slight decrease in the index of the whistling counts, but it was still above average. The summer roadside counts were similar to what it was in 2018. But again, remember there are parts of the Flint Hills that were certainly impacted by a wet spring and extensive prescribed burning of the Flint Hills like occurs in many years. The area of the state that may not be as good as some of the others would be clear in the extreme southeast part of the state. I think the forecast there said that opportunities would be poor to locally fair this year. Although spring surveys had increased for several years, 2 consecutive years of poor production has resulted in some population declines.
That's a factor of heavy flooding.
Yeah, I think that's probably in response to heavy rains and that flooding throughout the summer, not just a one-time event, but extended flooding events. So I think if you're in that region of the state, probably the best locations are going to be those the furthest west along the eastern edge of the Flint Hills. Then in the south-central prairie region of the state, that's long been considered kind of the heart of the Kansas quail populations. I think that should be good, and the Kansas upland bird forecast predicts that should be good hunting throughout most of that region.
All right, then, how to maximize the opportunity to take quail in this hunting season, which will continue through the balance of the month here. Well, one needs to know what they're doing to start with.
Yeah, it might be kind of short term to know what you're doing to become a competent quail hunter in the week prior to season opener, but certainly make sure that you're following the regulations. There's nothing that can ruin a hunt quicker by not following the regulations and getting a sour experience off of the bat. Make sure you have hunter education training if it's required. Make sure you've got the proper hunting license. Those licenses are available online and at many, many retail stores. I think quail hunting always works better when you can hunt with a mentor. You can certainly learn from their experiences as well as their failures. So if you can find someone to go along with, it's going to make it a much more enjoyable experience. Get a good map. Kansas publishes the walk-in hunting area maps. They're also available online. There are other websites that show property owners' names for contact, for permission. Remember, with 52 million acres of private lands in the state, many of those families allow hunting with permission. In fact, many of those families look forward to old friends and new friends coming by each year. But make sure that you've got that permission. Then I think next is know a little bit about how you should hunt. I like to hunt early in the morning. The quail are coming out, and then the golden hour is that last hour or so before dark when the birds move out of the crop fields and into the grass for roosting. And you don't have to overdo the first day. I think many times experienced hunters are so excited about it that they may push new hunters too hard initially and walk them too far and maybe lose a little enthusiasm on their first hunt. Keep in mind that all habitat is not created equal for quail. Try to hunt the good properties before you're out of energy. Those may be those field edges, those food plots, and those roosting areas later in the day. So I think those are some tips that can help people be a little bit more successful. But the main thing is to be prepared legally and mentally to enjoy yourself for at least the opening weekend.
It can be a great time, a great experience across the countryside. The quail hunting season in Kansas, again, opening this weekend and continuing through the month of November. Charlie, thanks for getting folks excited about this excellent opportunity. Charlie Lee, Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. That's our time for today. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.